Hi everyone, welcome. This is our last screening in association with the wonderful show on NeoRealism, which has been up all semester at the Gray Art Gallery on Washington Square, of which we have also a little small sideshow upstairs. And the show closes on Saturday, so I encourage you all, if you haven't already, to see this landmark exhibition in New York of neorealist photography. And for those of you who don't know, neorealism was essentially a post-war Italian phenomenon, which thereafter, in some ways, had manifestations in a number of other countries, but really came of age in the immediate post-war in Italy after World War II, when primarily directors turned their cameras to more ordinary, everyday, real stories, as opposed to the oftentimes more fabricated fascist melodramas which had taken place in studios for a number of years. So, introducing today one of the landmark films of the 20th century, now available on the Criterion Collection, who also generously helped sponsor the event. And the opening credits of Bicycle Thieves unfurl against what at first seems like a typical urban space. A meandering bus, men milling about, buildings. But generic housing blocks and barren lots let us know that we're at the city's margins. In fact, the residential project of the Val Melaina, where Antonio Ricci dwells, is located 5 miles from Rome proper. The fascist government had erected such housing complexes in the 1930s in order to demolish the shanty towns on the city's outskirts, as well as to transfer the working class out of the city center. The film's opening scene conveys the success of that displacement. Men cluster about as an employment agency functionary reads aloud scant job opportunities. Antonio Ricci, the film's protagonist-to-be, does not hear his name called aloud, even in his dejected need for work. He finally gets that work, and De Sica's 1948 film traces the arc of that temporary triumph, from elation to abjection, from a belonging ensured through a bicycle as a connection to work, and its sudden loss, as well as the character's even more fatal loss of face. We follow Ricci and his young son Bruno on their search for the stolen bicycle and its thief, a quest which reveals others far more destitute and desperate even than Ricci's humble family. If Italy had freed itself of fascism and of war here in 1948, the future was hardly one of unbridled hope for a huge swath of the population. Unemployment was at its peak, about 2 million out of 46 million Italians. Ricci gets work as a poster hanger, and we see him pinning up a poster of the latest Rita Hayworth film. In 1948, only 54 films were made in Italy itself. By contrast, 874 were imported, and of these, 558 were American. A sign, of course, of the growing hegemony of American sovereignty in the post-war and Italy's role as a subject of the Truman Doctrine. Of course, Bicycle Thieves transcends its historical context and its aesthetic significance as an example of neorealist cinema. Adapted by the scriptwriter Cesare Zavattini from a contemporary novel by Luigi Bartolini, Bicycle Thieves is based loosely on that tale by the same name. But Bartolini's middle-class protagonist in the novel searches for his stolen bike by means of a second bike, which he also owns. Ricci in the film is afforded no such luxury, and the film's urgency stems from that despair. But rather than the conventions of Hollywood cinema or fascist melodrama, De Sica and Zavattini chose purposefully to concentrate upon a seemingly throwaway news item. A worker whose bike was stolen hardly seems earth-shattering. That was, of course, precisely the crux of neorealist cinema, a focus on real events, the banalities of everyday life, a concentration upon the urban lower classes, and the use of non-professional actors. The father in the film, in fact, was a factory worker. The wife was in real life a journalist, while the young son was found on the streets of Rome. Someone, interestingly, had proposed to De Sica to use Cary Grant as the father, which would have made for quite a different film. Not one scene was shot in a studio, interestingly, which in any case had been bombed out by the Allies in their liberation of Rome. Yet even the seemingly artless offhandedness of neorealist technique often belies its own tricks. For one scene involving rain, for example, you will notice, perhaps, that De Sica got the Roman fire department to turn dozens of hoses on off-screen. The film's ending sequence makes extensive use of montage, and we find 70 shot changes in just 7 minutes. In his famous treatment of the film upon its release, the French film critic André Bazin commented, quote, "It would be no exaggeration to say that Bicycle Thieves is the story of a walk through Rome by a father and his son." Yet the typical monuments of Rome are not what we see. Ricci's travels wend quite an unfamiliar path, even to a viewer familiar with Roman topography. If you notice, it is instead the legacy of fascist architecture and the working class's exclusion from those spaces that loom largest. And in terms of the film's moral parable, which of course lifts it out of its precise limitation in a historical context, the Communist Party is in some ways criticized as much as the Catholic Church for ignoring the plight of the working classes, as you will see. But just to end on something with which the critic Franco Fortini summed up the film by a very sort of pithy and searing phrase, which is, the poor brutalize the poor, and the rich brutalize the poor in turn. And I just want to give just a last excerpt from Bazin's famous essay on Bicycle Thieves as it came out not long after the film's release. He says, "It takes meaning only because of the social and not psychological or aesthetic position of the victim. Without the haunting specter of unemployment which places the event in the Italian society of 1948, it would be an utterly banal misadventure. Likewise, the choice of a bicycle as the key object in the drama is characteristic both of Italian urban life and of a period when mechanical means of transportation were still rare and expensive. There is no need to insist on the hundreds of other meaningful details that multiply the vital links between scenario and actuality, situating the event in political and social history in a given place and time. And as just one of those details with perhaps more meaning than would be apparent. As you'll notice, the label on the bicycle says fides, which of course in Latin means faith. And so perhaps think about what kind of faith De Sica is alluding to, and please enjoy the film.